Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to our event, This Life in Marx, Value, Normativity, Freedom, where we will be discussing Martin Hägglund's recent book, This Life, Secular Faith, and Spiritual Freedom. Martin's book sets out a conception of human freedom informed by a radical new reading of Marx, which will be the focus of today's event. Martin Hägglund is the Burgett Baldwin Professor of Comparative Literature and Humanities at Yale University. His book, This Life, has been an international bestseller and is the subject of a symposium in the Los Angeles Review of Books, as well as a special issue of The Philosopher. Michael Lazarus, whose article is whose article forthcoming in Historical Materialism is also the occasion for today's event. Teaches politics and philosophy at Monash University. His article entitled The Lives of Marx, Marx's Philosophy After Pippin, Postone and Hägglund will be available online in the near future. Matthew Abbott is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at Federation University. Matthew has reviewed This Life for the Marx and Philosophy Review of Books. And Konal Kash is a PhD candidate in Romance Studies at Cornell University. And Konal wrote about This Life for B2O. So we will kick things off with a general discussion of the book's relevance for Marx and Marxism. That'll be our first topic. So Michael.
Right. Thanks, Jensen, and thanks, HM, for putting this event on. So I suppose maybe where I'd start would be, I think something quite particular and unique about reading some of the initial receptions of This Life. The book deals so much with Marx and has a positive reading of Marx. But one of the things I was struck by reading some of the initial reviews was that they mainly focused on the first half of the book, the shorter half of the book that deals mainly with religion. And some of the reviewers was somewhat bemused by the presence of Marx as being a central aspect and central argument of the book. And so some of the reviews in the book was reviewed in a lot of the popular intellectual press, and the argument for socialism was often rejected out of hand. So, for instance, James Wood in the New Yorker said about the discussion of economic theory in This Life, and I quote, "Hägglund makes himself terribly vulnerable to critique, but perhaps also to teasing. The professor of comparative literature is wading into alien depths of political economy." So part of my piece really that's forthcoming in Historical Materialism Journal was trying to deal in an in-depth way that the way Marx in general and the role of his value form theory in particular motivated the core thesis of This Life. And Martin's reading of Marx's concept of value is, I think, one of the most important aspects of the book, and his ability to bring that discussion to fruition, drawing very deeply on German idealism as well. So I suppose maybe in the kind of the first reading that I had of This Life was that it is important as a work of translation in terms of taking issues that are usually restricted to debates within academic philosophy, especially the issue of German idealism, and those that are often confined to intra-Marxist discussions, especially in terms of value theory. And what This Life does is show their importance of understanding the concerns of everyday life. So one thing that This Life does particularly well is that it shows that Marx's critique of political economy is a theory of life activity. And in the early parts of the article, I wanted to kind of show the resonance of This Life with Marshall Berman's All That's Solid That Melts into Air, which is a classic work of Marxism. And one of the reasons I think it bears a helpful comparison is that All That's Solid Melts into Air had genuine popular appeal outside of Marx studies. And like Berman, This Life brings together, and his interview bringing together a reading of Marx, which brought out the importance of time, particularly Marx's concept of time, and infused this reading with Marx with a rich literary and religious studies angle, and showed that the concerns of Marx's theory that could be put in a popular register didn't need to sacrifice the sophistication of the account. And what I think another aspect that bears a helpful comparison is that This Life emphasizes the idea of freedom, which in Marx's words understands human beings as social individuals, subjects that articulate themselves as individual identities, but can only do so within the rich fabric of social recognition by others of equal status. And this sees a kind of spiritual life, spiritual wealth of modern life. And one of the other aspects of This Life, or the argument about in terms of value that Hägglund builds into This Life, one of the greatest achievements is synthesizing this Hegelian idea of normativity with Marx's value form theory. And here, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is that Martin draws heavily on Rochus Pistone's critique of traditional Marxism to bear upon the concepts of freedom, and makes an argument for revaluing value, a social form of life beyond capital, where our time is not defined by socially necessary labour time, but instead what Martin calls in the book socially available free time. I'll just leave my opening remarks there.
Should I pick up on this? Yeah. So I think, we'll just kind of put a few ideas on the table each, and then Martin can respond and synthesize. I wanted to pick up on, this thing that Michael just said about the significance of, Marx's theory of value to questions of everyday life. I think Martin's framing in the book is really super useful for thinking through these questions. Just grounding his account of Marx and a kind of rereading, translation of Marx, as Michael said, in this fundamental philosophical emphasis on the fundamental grounding of all philosophical concerns in finitude and all concerns of life in the value of our finite time, as Martin writes. One of the first things it does, I think, is just it cuts against certain forms of Marxism, certain utopian forms of Marxism, which Martin addresses, I guess, most directly towards the end of the book. A picture of, that we have received images of in sort of like Stalinist kitsch of kind of socialism or communism is the kind of heaven brought down to earth, this kind of picture of things which we can very easily see kind of problems with, but I think Martin gives a really fundamental philosophical grounding for how this should be overcome, for the problems of this kind of picture of socialism. And the concept of finitude and the value of our finite time also just allows him to translate. This is something we'll talk about more later, but the whole notion of value in Marx, right, which, can, as Michael said, can potentially seem foreign to everyday concerns, let's say, that every concept of value fundamentally, and this is something that Martin shows very powerfully in his reading of the mature Marx, of Marx's Capital and Grundrisse, implicitly, what is most fundamentally valued in every economic form is the finite time of life. And owning that question explicitly is very central to how Martin frames his conception of democratic socialism. And so I think just on a very sort of intuitive, immediate level, I think this is very powerful for connecting Marxian questions to questions of everyday life, just to echo what Michael said. The other thing I wanted to sort of mention is also that I think the framing in terms of finitude and the value of finite time is also very powerful, and this is something Martin addresses quite explicitly in, I guess, particularly chapter 4 of the book, in sort of overcoming, I guess, an opposition we often find within Marxism between privileging the early or the late Marx between the notion of alienation and a kind of scientific overcoming or dismissal of the category of alienation. I think what Martin is able to do in a lot of how he frames, but he very explicitly argues against this kind of reading of Marx's notion of species being as a kind of naive humanism attached to a kind of positive conception of human nature. He shows that really species being is precisely the capacity we have to question our own nature, to redefine our own nature ourselves. He develops a particular language for doing this through his notion of spiritual freedom, which we'll discuss. And, I think one of the things that's, I guess, essentially what I think he does in reframing the notion of alienation, which again, he's able to do by saying the thing that we value fundamentally always implicitly is the finite time of life. He's able to say that alienation is a concept we need to retain, and the ideas of the early Marx are fundamental and are, fundamental to making sense of the mature Marx's most important ideas. But what we are alienated from under capitalism is not some sort of fixed nature, but is our capacity to own the question of our own life, to treat our life as an end rather than a means. And I think in doing that, he allows us to overcome a lot of the kind of limitations of a critique of alienation that exists within a certain strand of Marxism, which is important in as much as it's, so with thinkers like Althusser, let's say, which, is important insofar as it's a critique of this kind of reductive idea of the fixed basis of human nature that we are alienated from, the kind of nostalgia of that conception of alienation, which people like Althusser are rightly critical of. But Martin is able to show that actually, if we get rid of, this is just a poor understanding of alienation. And if we get rid of the category of alienation at all, where does any kind of moral force to any of, to the demand for socialism, where could it possibly stand? And so I think Martin gives a really powerful way of bringing alienation back in a way that overcomes all of these kinds of problems that people have been rightly critical of, but then in their criticism have kind of left this kind of gaping hole in our understanding of what are the actual kind of moral, fundamental moral necessity raised by socialism.
So thanks, Jason. There's a familiar paradigm in recent political philosophy developed in the 90s by Nancy Fraser and others, and it's still very much at work in the writings of some political theorists and philosophers like Walter Ben Michaels and others, and it's still very live, I think, in certain in political debate as well, debate among activists, in which a kind of politics of recognition is counterposed against a politics of redistribution. And people like Fraser and Michaels, who think of themselves as being on the left of the liberals they critique, and perhaps as being Marxist, they counterpose this politics of equality, economic equality, to this politics of identity and difference and recognition. So we're all quite familiar with this paradigm, but I think this life actually breaks with that paradigm in quite a decisive way. It puts forward a Marxist politics of recognition based on the idea that liberal democracy cannot deliver on its promise of freedom and equality. On the other hand, this critique of liberal democracy is grounded in a Marxist account of exploitation, where the barrier to achieving genuine recognition is wage labor and the value form that underlies it. So it's because labor under capitalism proceeds under the external compulsion of capital accumulation that we cannot own our activity in the way that Connell was just describing. And that's why we can't see our activity recognized by others. Right? So it's precisely through a certain politics of recognition that we have to achieve economic equality. And to realize equality in this way means going beyond redistribution to the overcoming of wage labor in achieving democratic ownership of the means of production. So I think it's interesting to sort of look back on these debates, and maybe Martin's exchange with Michaels and the LA Review of Books recently as well, and see that it's precisely by giving up on recognition that the politics of redistribution kind of collapses into reformism. That's especially clear in Michaels. So I think, yeah, from this book you can see that this debate, sort of old debate now, I suppose, but still alive in some respects, is really a debate between liberals and social democrats, and Marxists need to find ways to push through it.
Great. Thank you so much. First of all, to Historical Materialism for hosting this, and to Michael and Connell and Matthew for participating, to Jensen for moderating. It's a great pleasure for me to be in this conversation with people who have all written very insightfully about the book. And I, just to continue on these threads already suggested, I wanted to start with this question of value and what the book does with value, because on the one hand there is a very technical sense of value and value form when in Marxist discourse, and one thing I want to bring out is precisely like that. It's not just a metaphorical connection between that technical sense of value and how value is produced under capitalism, and the question of like what we value existentially. So one way of thinking about the book, it tries to show we can't actually separate economical questions from existential questions, which means that like all the Marxist concerns, while being deeply rooted in analysis of political economy, are also deeply relevant for understanding like how we learn what to value, how we value one another, how we relate to one another. So that's a way in which also I want to bring out that material questions, questions of historical materialism, are deeply related to spiritual questions, here not meaning spiritual in the sense of supernatural or having to do with an immortal soul or some sort of absolute peace of mind that we would achieve through meditation. On the contrary, spiritual questions are questions of what we value or what we take to be worth doing with our time. And we are spiritual beings, and here I use the term spiritual the way Hegel uses it, not because there's anything supernatural about us, but because we are social and historical beings who can question and transform our way of living. That's the distinct way in which we are living and natural beings, that it's an issue for us, how we should relate to one another, to ourselves, what we should value, and what we take to be worth doing. And our species being, in Marx's sense, as Connell reminded us, is precisely that, not that we have some essence, but that we are the kinds of beings who, for whom it is at issue, what we should do with our time, how we should relate to one another, and developing and actualizing our freedom is developing and actualizing our capacity to take ownership and responsibility for that question as social individuals. So I'm sort of reframing all of these questions about alienation, emancipation, about the social domination under capitalism and the possible emancipation under socialism as having to do with, in a deeper sense, our ability to lead and our lives as essentially social individuals, essentially dependent on one another, our ability to mutually recognize one another in our needs and abilities. So that means that the book doesn't want to make a choice between addressing those sort of large-scale questions, but also engaging in very technical debates about Marxist analysis of political economy, and want to show how all of these things can't be thought one without the other. So one thing I'm hoping with this panel is that we can sort of move between those levels, precisely both talking about so large-scale questions, but also how this can illuminate the stakes of what can seem like very technical debates in Marxism, but actually has to do with very concretely how are we able to take care of one another, to own the question of what to do with our lives?
Great. So I think that we'll go ahead and move to the next question. The next topic is the theme of natural life and spiritual freedom in the work. And Matthew will start us off.
So why does Marx think that machines cannot produce value? Marxists have spent a lot of time grappling with this question. I think it seems to some like a kind of item of mere orthodoxy, something that can function as kind of a shibboleth, separating the true Marxists from the false ones. But many who support the thesis do so with reference to notions of dead and living labor, of course. But I think this life shows that that's it's no mere metaphor, right? That on the account presented in this life, surplus time is something exclusively generated by living beings, plants, animals, and human beings, all of which produce more lifetime than they need to kind of expend on maintaining themselves. So it's only because we enjoy surplus time in this way as living beings that we can be exploited in Marx's sense. That's why labour power can produce more value than the value of the socially necessary labour time required to maintain it. Now, it sometimes seems like Marx doesn't quite fully grasp this, or Adorno kind of takes him to task for this in Minima Moralia, right? For sort of dismissing the possibility that animals could produce surplus value. But I think what he's grasping at in his passages about the distinctiveness of human labour, the labour of self-conscious animals, is also important to register, and this life lays some groundwork for this too. Surplus time is logically dependent on the fact that organisms have a limited lifetime. There would be no extra time to enjoy if we were immortal. But only human beings have a self-conscious relationship to the limited time of our lives. So the exploitation of surplus time in human life is exploitative in a distinctive way. Even if it were possible to kind of produce surplus value through exploiting animals, it wouldn't have the same character because they don't have that relationship to their surplus time. It means that for us, it's the exploitation of our capacity to live in the world of freedom, right? As Martin describes it in the book, as well as the world of necessity, the realm of necessity, or the exploitation of our spiritual freedom. I think this is also a way of kind of explaining the sense in which the value form is historically specific as well. For of course, as Martin acknowledges in the book, machines could produce value if our measure of evaluation was transformed in a socialist society. In such a society, they would do it by diminishing the amount of time we need to spend in the realm of necessity, which is basically what they do in domestic life, like dishwashers and vacuum cleaners and so on. And I think this is kind of why the thesis that machines don't produce value seems so kind of perverse to bourgeois economists and non-Marxists. People really struggle to understand this thesis, right? As Marxists are always saying, bourgeois economists cannot grasp the historical specificity of the capitalist form of life. And that's why they can't grasp, I would say, the sense in which machines now cannot produce value for capitalist society, as well as the sense in which they could produce value under different social conditions, right? So I think there is a really quite a powerful account of the historical specificity of the value form built into this book, which comes out in this quite distinctive account of why it is we can be exploited.
That was really good. I think I have a bunch of thoughts about that. But the specific thing I wanted to talk about, which only really is addressed explicitly in a couple of pages of the book, but I think also can illuminate some of the what the stakes of the distinction Martin makes between natural and spiritual freedom, and which might echo some of what Matthew's just said, is there's a kind of imminent critique of post-humanist thought in a few pages in Martin's book. And essentially, the point that Martin makes, which on one level is sort of intuitive, but I don't think it's ever been quite sort of articulated as clearly, is that those who, those people in the humanities who want to kind of overcome or refuse entirely the distinction, any kind of qualitative distinction between human beings and other animals. And of course, there are various reasons why we want to criticize various ways in which those distinctions have been made. The reason Martin carries out an imminent critique of this kind of flattening of any such distinction and around the questions of self-consciousness that Matthew's just raised. The reason that Martin carries out an imminent critique is that he shows that, in fact, all such thinkers, in fact, tacitly rely upon precisely the distinction that they claim to be against, because who are they talking to when they make these arguments? They're talking to human beings. They're talking to a particular kind of spiritually free being that is capable of listening to reasons and reflecting on their own behavior in light of the reasons that are being raised. No one is telling a non-human animal to fight climate change. No one is telling a non-human animal to stop eating meat. These are questions that are raised to a particular kind of living being, a particular kind of animal, which human beings are as animals that are capable of listening to reasons. And so this kind of way of, I think, marshalling this imminent critique of this kind of line of argument in the humanities is, I think, a really useful one, and the distinction between natural and spiritual freedom, right, is a really powerful way of doing this, because we're not saying that there is no that we're not sort of primitivizing other animals in this really sort of in a really reductive way. We're by, again, beginning with the question of the finite time, the value of finite time. Martin is showing that, yeah, for all living beings, on some level, this question is at stake, or this question is at play in their life. But the form of self-consciousness that human beings have is such that this can become an explicit question for us, what we do with this finite time. And so all the questions about exploitation that Matthew has raised kind of followed from that. But I think that critique of the imminent critique of post-humanism, the fact that we actually cannot, it's impossible to dispense with the distinction between natural and spiritual freedom. And so how do we actually own that distinction in a way that acknowledges what we're already tacitly taking for granted?
Some really interesting points to pick up there. And I just wanted to kind of start maybe with a point that Martin mentioned before, just to confirm that this idea of spiritual freedom here has to be read as a development of Hegel's idea of spirit, and that inbuilt in this is a conception of what one takes their identity to be in terms of commitments they make to others, the idea of self relation, but also relation with others. And there's an important part of the neurology of spirit, which Hegel writes that there's, by staking one's life, the freedom is proven to be our essence. And I think there's something really valuable in the way that Martin develops this idea of the stakes of a human life being in both our identity that we have to ourselves and to others, but in the risk that's involved in any human action, that failure is always there, that to decide to do anything, we have to decide whether we ought to do it. We've got to make, and in making those decisions, the risk of failure and the risk of success is always is always there, it's always present. And once we have this account of finitude that Connell spoke about just before, we become able to articulate that we only have so much time to do anything, and then it gives the stakes of our actions. It brings them into view. I think there's a really interesting part of towards the very end of the book where Martin uses the example of Martin Luther King as to help illuminate this idea of staking one's life. And he brings, using this example, he brings together the idea of staking one's life. So Martin Luther King has to, it's essential to the fight against oppression that he puts his life on the line. He's willing to die for that sense of justice, but also towards the end of his life. And there's some really interesting historical work at the end of this life, connection between the forms of civil disobedience that Martin Luther King is engaging in the end of his life, but also a kind of increasing sense of class struggle. And towards the very end, I think what's really well articulated is that a concept of spiritual freedom articulates something in terms of the class struggle as well, that there's something normative in terms of how we commit ourselves to political struggles, as well as our our commitments to our personal lives, to our families, to our interests, to these types of things, that there's a really clear political articulation that happens there as well.
Great. Thank you for all of those remarks. I want to start off by picking up on Matthew's remarks about surplus time, because in a way, I really think that's the key to the argument of the book. And one of the real breakthroughs for me in working on Marx was thinking about this relation between surplus time and surplus value. And again, it starts out from the fact that what's unique about living beings, as Matthew recalled, is that they produce a surplus of time. I have this plant next to me here, and even if I don't water it for a while, it can survive even without nourishment for some time. And other animals can use that surplus time to enjoy themselves, cats playing, dogs doing things. But what's unique about rational animals, what I'm calling, that we don't just have that surplus of time. We can also ask ourselves what we should do with it and what's worth doing with it. And again, that's why we can produce surplus value in Marx's sense, but and can be exploited. I mean, if I had to spend all my time just surviving, then you could never exploit me to do anything else, because as soon as you force me to do something else, I would die. But it's precisely because I have this extra time that can be used for other activities. And the problem is not that we use that time for other ends than our own, but precisely that they are in the service of generating capital growth rather than expanding sort of meaningful social time. So the analysis sort of goes from that fundamental question of that's common to all forms of life, that we generate a surplus of time, but then what's sort of spiritually free is that, again, we can ask that question of what to do with our time. And that's supposed to bring into the distinctive sense in which we are responsible for the way we lead our lives. And that's precisely what's supposed to be distinctive of the kinds of animals we are. And a common misconception is that would then mean that we sort of have the right to exploit other animals or the natural environment. But my point is rather that that sort of freedom is what makes us more responsible than other animals. It doesn't necessarily give us more rights, but that means that we can be held accountable for how we treat the environment, for how we treat other animals. And that's part of the distinctive sense of responsibility that I want to say is that Marxism actually allows us to think through on the deepest levels.
I think we have a few minutes to spare, so I'll open it up for a brief discussion among the panelists.
I think Matthew had a follow-up he said in the chat.
Yeah, just to pick up on some aspects of what you just said, Martin. but especially what Connell said as well. I mean, I think it's really important to understand what kind of motivates post-humanist critiques of Enlightenment rationality and see how they kind of fall short on their own terms. I think it's incumbent on us to avoid making the mistake that post-humanists accuse Enlightenment thinkers of making, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, which is kind of separating the human from the rest of nature, and failing to grasp the sense in which there are forms of agency inherent in animal life. Right? So on the one hand, we can emphasize, what Martin's just been talking about, which is what is distinctive about human animals, that we are rational animals or spiritually free beings, to use, you can use different terminology for capturing this. But on the other hand, it's really important that this is something that emerges out of, the rest of nature as a result of, events in our evolutionary history. There's nothing supernatural or spooky about it. And it's not to downplay the fact that other animals enjoy a certain form of freedom as well, right? That they lead lives that matter to them, that they are not, mere mechanisms or whatever. They are agents who have, who make moral claims on us because of that, right? So I think it's really important to sort of, on the one hand, capture human distinctiveness, but without sort of downplaying the agency of animal life. And it's a good way to answer the post-humanists in the way that Connell was getting at, I think, because their critique is sort of well motivated, but in the end, sort of misplaced.
Yeah, I mean, just to make that very, very concrete, is that like, because if you want to collapse that difference, and I agree with Matthew that and it's an important part of the account, that this distinctiveness doesn't make us supernatural. It doesn't mean a rupture between the kind of animals we are and other living beings. But the distinctive sense of responsibility, and why you can't collapse that distinction, you can bring that out very clearly by just posing the question. If you're going to collapse that, you have two choices. Either you have to hold all other animals accountable for how they prioritize their own species, then we have to hold lions accountable for killing antelopes. And so either you have to do that, or you have to exonerate us from responsibility, saying that like, oh, we are no more responsible than other animals for how we relate to other animals and to the environment. And those are really the only two options you have if you don't work out the right way of thinking about our distinctiveness. Again, either all animals are responsible and should change their sexism and speciesism and etc., or we are not responsible. So that's just a way in which it is uncircumventable to thematize, for the very reasons, if we want to change and have a better relation to the environment, to other animals, that presupposes that we can actually take responsibility for how we relate to other animals, to the environment, and that we can change it. That's the way in which even a post-humanist critique must presuppose the distinctive kind of responsibility we have.
I would just briefly add that one of the emancipatory consequences of Enlightenment and modernity, which are also often seen within the post-humanist tradition as a kind of rupture or a stain or an imposition, is that in coming to recognize ourselves as recognizers and valuers, part of what that also opens up is a capacity to see other animals as, recognizers and valuers in their own distinctive way. So in fact, Enlightenment and sort of the modern project, bourgeois right, this is sort of an opportunity for the first time to see animals as the distinctive kinds of valuers that they are. So even if we haven't lived up to that, this is, one of the possibilities that Marx's project, I think, further opens up. It's also a consequence of the kind of narrative that Martin offers in his book. So I think that brings us to the third topic, critique and imminent critique of capitalism. And I think Matthew will be our first respondent here.
So imminent critique, as I understand it, is a critique of something on its own terms. Rather than taking a view from nowhere and attacking a position from the outside, or purporting to, imminent critique involves inhabiting a position, kind of grasping what is right about it, and then demonstrating how it fails to live up to its own internal standards. This is what we find in Hegel's phenomenology, of course, but it's also crucial to Marx's method in Capital. Right? So we have to consider not just, why, but how he engages with classical political economy. So his point is not simply to attack, say, Adam Smith on manufacture and the division of labor, but to show how his work expresses contradictions in the form of life of which he was part. That involves showing what Smith gets right, and then critiquing him for not being able to follow through on his own insights, right? For only grasping the true character of this mode of production in a kind of diminished way. This is the sense, I think, in which Capital is a critique of political economy. Marx isn't saying that political economy is merely an expression of ideology. Right? He wants to inhabit political economy and show how it falls short in these ways. And I think Marx gets this from Kant and Hegel, and this is something that Martin then inherits from Marx and sets to work in this life through these imminent critiques of liberalism. This is some of the most sort of politically interesting aspects of the book, which I'd like to discuss further. This idea that liberal democracy cannot deliver on its promises of freedom and equality, such that that the socialist project is about holding liberalism to its own principles, if you like, and showing how it can't actually deliver on what it claims to, and with the implication being that socialism can. I think in that sense that the book can be useful for thinking through some of these issues surrounding critique, which have been a bit vexing, I think, for both for post-structuralists and maybe more scientifically inclined Marxists. So you could think of Foucault, right, in the sort of ambiguous status of the normative stances that he takes in his work. He's clearly doing something like a critical theory, but he's always claiming not to be taking a stance on the social forms he discusses. And this leads, as we know, to a great deal of disagreement and maybe just confusion among Foucault scholars, and people always arguing back and forth over whether he, or about his, his actual stance on neoliberalism or whatever. Or consider the Marxists who are always saying that Marx's critique of capital is not a moral one. They're right, obviously, in a certain sense, right? Marx is not standing outside the capitalist system and denouncing it as morally bad. Right? His point isn't even really that exploitation in his sense is morally bad. I think he does think that, but that's not actually the point that he's making. So it's not a moral critique in that sense. It's not a view from nowhere, external critique in that sense. But of course, Marx's project is part of a broader project of human emancipation, seeks to identify and overcome the deficiencies in the capitalist form of life. And Marx can do this not in spite, but because he inhabits that form of life. That's why the imminent critique is possible. And so I think understanding this could dispel some of these confusions. If you don't understand how critique can be imminent or maybe even needs to be imminent, you can't understand critique except as moralistic and totalizing and whatever. So yeah, there's also, I think, some points we could make here about Marx's attitude to history, the sense in which communism has to emerge out of capitalism, but without, that entailing some sort of Stalinist thesis about historical stages or whatever.
Yeah, that was great. That was really great. Just kind of articulation of what's at stake in imminent critique. So I think I might come back to a number of things that have come up already. I mean, the particular point on this kind of theme that I wanted to bring out was, and something that I think Michael sort of raised earlier in the second on the second point, is the question of how capitalism opens up the question of identity in a historically new way, while also in various ways interrupting our capacity to really own that question. So, you know, these are points that individually are not necessarily unique to I'm not necessarily the first person to make each of these individual points, but I think, again, the essential framing of the book in terms of the value of finite time really grounds them philosophically. But the idea that within capitalism, once we have a wage relation, the distinction between the time of one's life that one gives to an employer and one's own time is kind of very explicitly on the table, is very explicitly present to individuals in a way that it is not nearly as explicitly under pre-capitalist social formations. Again, this just goes back to like the point about finitude that we've discussed. Martin's framing allows us to do this without having this kind of really primitivizing conception of like people under pre-capitalist societies. Like these questions still existed in as much as, you know, we are the kind of being who have a self-conscious relationship to the finite time of our lives. And so it's not that sort of, this somewhat to echo what Matthew just said, you know, there would be a version of Marxism which is just kind of modes of production are completely discontinuous, completely incommensurable with each other. The ideologies, the consciousness of people under those modes of production are completely discontinuous with each other. And so, you know, it's only under capitalism that identity becomes a question. Like that, Martin has a very important way of overcoming that kind of completely stagist, that kind of stagist view, while also actually being able to articulate why there is something distinctive to what capitalism makes available in terms of the explicitation of this question of, you know, who am I? I can ask this question and I have many more resources for articulating this question. I'm sort of attacked with, I can't fail to ask myself this question because of the kind of ways that the distinction between the time of my life that I give to someone else and then this free time that doesn't really define me by a particular status. All right, the time that I have outside of work does not define me within a particular status, within a particular social role, in the way it might for someone living under feudalism, let's say. At the same time, capitalism can't really allow us to actually kind of own this question in a positive sense, right? There's the question of, you know, I can do X and Y with my free time, but that time is being bought with my own labor time or with someone else's labor time. And so the kind of what is essentially being explicitly valued in that society is not the free time of our lives to actually determine for ourselves. That free time is a kind of byproduct that is negatively defined by capitalism. And so we can sort of do things with this free time without it being actually recognized as a social value. One of the things that's powerful, I think, in what Martin does with this topic is to show that, you know, even like the rich under capitalism are alienated in this sense, that they are not experiencing a true form of freedom. It's not as if the goal of socialism is just for everyone to be a kind of live like the idle rich do today. Precisely, I mean, this may tie into, I guess, what we'll discuss in the fourth topic, but precisely because all of the forms of leisure time that you're able to have if you are an owner of capital, if you just have the money to not have to work, that again is only a kind of negative possession of time that has been bought at the expense of someone else, such that you can only relate to others through the kind of power you wield over them in terms of the power of your own free time relative to them. And so there is not a kind of free exchange of spiritually free beings in the relations that you can take up to other people, even as the rich can obviously avoid the worst kind of conditions under capitalism. And so I think the way the book, the framing around finitude allows us, brings out, I mean, I think, the comparison to Marshall Bowman that Michael made is useful here, because Bowman is interested in these kinds of questions, I think, about how modernity makes this question of who am I kind of radically open and available. But I think philosophically, modern really grounds this in terms of this question of, the value of our finite time. This is always at stake in all human societies. Capitalism brings it out in this particularly explicit way for individuals, and is also sort of unable to fundamentally value it.
All right, I want to say a few things about the value form argument specifically in this slide, but I'll keep the remarks brief just because it's the main focus of the article. So I just want to say how it relates to the dimension of imminent critique in this slide, because Martin follows but offers a very interesting critique of the stone here. But before I get to that, I just want to say that I think there's also something very useful in the term that Martin uses here for understanding Marxism or some type of socialist politics, which he describes as democratic socialism. And part of that argument, it's distinct from the historical versions of democratic socialism through the 20th century, is to emphasize Marx's imminent critique of bourgeois politics, in which, read texts like on the Jewish question, Marx is finding fault with the false promise that is offered by bourgeois politics, that it claims a particular type of political equality, but delivers a contradictory and alienated political form in which there's significant inequality in terms of civil society. And Martin brings Hegel in here, and there's a very interesting discussion of the contradictions within Hegel's own understanding of civil society and the state, in which Hegel offers a pessimistic and ultimately contradictory view of civil society, in which Hegel has to acknowledge the role of poverty and forms of alienation, but is unable to provide a solution to it within his own. And one thing that we can use to kind of understand why that is a problem for Hegel is that if we apply Hegel's own criteria for a rational form of institutions, his account of civil society kind of fails on that, on those grounds. We kind of look for rational criteria within Hegel's understanding of civil society. There's a failure there. So Martin, through this reading of Hegel, connects part of Hegel's question with what Marx takes up with his critique of capitalism. So for moving from a system of needs, the philosophy of right, to a system of capital that is offered in Marx's mature social theory. And one dimension of this is that Marx develops an imminent critique of economics. So both in terms of the economic categories that he's dealing with, value, commodities, money, capital. And so part of this argument and how it fits in this life is that Martin develops Marx's critique of political economy and imminent critique of political economy with his own imminent critique of forms of redistribution, whether they be in a UBI or in Keynesian economics and so on. So there's a kind of a dual form of imminent critique that kind of plays out through the book. And just to say a little bit about that, because it's not just the imminent critique that is constructed there, is that Martin connects it with what he describes as the rational aim of freedom. So for Marx's value theory to work, for Marx to provide an account of the social form of life under capitalism as a historically specific form in which wealth is produced by wage labor, for Marx to provide that account, that there's got to be some conception within that of how freedom can be articulated. And Martin does a lot of work here to kind of drawing on volume 3 of Capital, where there's idea of the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, Martin joins these up and says, well, as soon as we have any type of human activity, productive activity, there's necessity involved in that, and in opposition to some of Marx's critics, including Hannah Arendt, that see Marx's idea of labor as just being about necessity, just being about the kind of bare facts of labor. Martin helps articulate that really involved in Marx's argument here is to say that there's a connection between the intelligibility of freedom requires some necessity, but Marx is interested in flipping it around, in inverting it, that the realm of freedom is supposed to rule over any type of necessity, and that I think helps articulate part of the imminent critique of economic categories that plays out in Marx's work, and helps us articulate some of the issues with wage labor. And so Martin does a really good job, I think, of presenting Marx's argument about the abstract domination of capital. So there's a discussion there where he says, well, the capitalist might have really read and taken seriously John Stuart Mill. He might have read and taken very seriously John Rawls, but the way that the abstract domination of capital necessitates accumulation, necessitates its own self-movement, there's no way out of it, that exploitation continues to be produced and socially reproduced. This kind of grounding the concept of imminent critique within Marx's critique of economic categories plays a large part in Marx's argument. I mean, in characterizing Marx's argument in this stuff.
Great. Thank you for all of those remarks. I mean, I think a helpful way of focalizing this question of how Marx's critique of capitalism works and why it is an imminent critique, which has already been spoken to. I mean, a helpful way of focalizing that is to recall that before Marx, like the standard type of socialist critique of capitalism was precisely one that would portray capitalists as evil villains who sort of exploit workers. And one thing, Marx, that goes against that type of moralism is to show that the sort of exploitative relation to ourselves and one another is not psychologically contingent on the capitalism. It's built into how we reproduce our lives and how we value. So, for example, as a capitalist employer, I cannot in that role treat my employees as ends in themselves, as their well-being as ends in itself, because everything that I have to expend on securing their well-being counts as a negative cost for me, so there's a necessity of treating them as means for the ends of producing profit, and that's not something that's optional for me as a capitalist, just as ultimately too, that also means that I can't, as a producer, really own the question of what I think is worth producing, what we ought to produce, make the best possible products in view of our social needs. Instead, I myself am dominated by the need to produce something that is profitable, and because if I don't do that, my business will go out of business and I will have to be a wage laborer and so on. So many of these, that's the way in which Marx's critique is not a moralizing critique, as Matthew emphasized. But that doesn't mean that there is not, a normative element here. But that normativity is not psychological and moralizing. That normativity has to do with a commitment to social freedom as that which would allow us to flourish as the kinds of beings who we are, and why that promise of social freedom is both opened up in a historically new way through capitalism, but why it can't be fulfilled as long as we are subjected to capitalist social relations. So that's one of the dynamics I'm trying to bring out in the books, to show what kind of freedom because there has to be, for us to even be critics of capitalism, there has to be something in the name of which we deem it as a deficient, dominating, alienating form of life that should be overcome. And I'm trying to spell out what the notion of freedom, what notion of freedom you need to have to make sense of how and why we criticize capitalism. But again, that notion of freedom can't just be something that comes from nowhere. It has to have emerged through our historical development itself, and that's why it has to be imminent to the form of life. And that's supposed to lend greater specificity to both of our understanding of the contradictions of capitalism under which we live, but also why we are committed to overcoming it and what would be required for that, and why it's not enough with redistribution or a welfare state, etc., because the deepest problems are structural to the way we produce value, to the way we reproduce our lives.
Great. All right, let's transition to the final topic, post-capitalism and principles of democratic socialism. And Conal will start us off.
Okay, great. So, I mean, in the article I wrote about the book, which came out a while ago now, sort of a few months after the book came out, one of the questions that I kind of address is this question of the state under socialism, under democratic socialism that Martin raises. And so I'll try and say a few things about that while trying to tie into kind of the larger stakes of Martin's articulation of democratic socialism. So if some of these, the kind of notion of freedom that Martin was articulating just then, how is this socially grounded? Moving beyond what I was describing earlier as the kind of purely negative conception of freedom that is the only form of freedom possible under capitalism, right? Like I was saying, or even for the wealthy, it's only the kind of negative freedom of having bought a certain amount of time from the labor of others, which I can use in various ways to wield power over them. One of the things that's very powerful in Martin's argument is this point that no one is free until everyone is free, which is kind of very grounded in a very real way in the sense in his articulation of the principles of democratic socialism, in the sense that freedom ultimately is the capacity to actually take responsibility, be responsible to, be held accountable for my own activity, to see myself in my own activity, and thereby be responsible to what I do, how it affects others, its role in the world. Capitalism does not allow anyone to genuinely own this question. And so the principles of collective ownership of the means of production, the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, these are principles that Martin lays out, and I'm sure we'll come back to them in greater detail, that really try to ground, these can sound kind of principles that, again, maybe in some articulations may not immediately intuitively be related to questions of everyday life. And again, one of the powers of the book is how clearly it demonstrates that these questions are kind of ones that are fundamental to everyday life, that are implicitly at stake for us already, just to echo what Martin just said about freedom. But the specific question that I raised in my piece is this question of, is the notion of the state a notion that makes sense for thinking about the kinds of societies that we would live under democratic socialism? I think one of the advantages of Martin's kind of use of reclamation of that we would need some form of state is that we want to overcome a certain form of Marxism that will say that under socialism we'll just kind of immediately know ourselves, know our desires, know our interests, and we will not need any form of social mediation, or let's say everything will be entirely social immediately. We'll be, this is one way of reading Marx's idea of sort of humanism as naturalism, naturalism as humanism, that we will be totally united with ourselves, such that we would not need any kind of institutional forms. And this, I think, is a very problematic picture, and I think Martin is right to kind of criticize that version of a kind of overcoming of any institutional forms that would be proper to socialism or communism, because we would just be so kind of immediately united with ourselves as a collective subject. so I think that's an important critique to make, that we will still need, want, cherish institutional forms in order to express our own freedom, precisely because freedom always entails the capacity to be challenged by others. To do that, we need institutional forms in which we can each express ourselves, challenge each other, etc. There's then a larger question, I think, about a lot of the Marxist tradition, I guess, has thought about the state, not just the state under capitalism, but the state as such, being a site of class power, being a site of the power of particular social groups to wield over others. And so there's this kind of subsequent question, I guess, which I raised in my piece, is like, in what sense would a truly democratic society be thought of as a society that would have a state? On some level, this is perhaps just a semantic question. We could just, does it have a different name? Does that really matter? But the question of, I guess, how to articulate what the institutional forms are that are genuinely democratic, rather than being seated in the power of particular social groups as they have been historically. And I think Martin has this point comes up somewhat in William Clay Roberts's piece in response to the book that Martin replied to, so that might be something that we pick up on. But this is kind of one of the threads that I guess has been a line of discussion about the kind of more concrete arguments around democratic socialism in the book. Yeah, so that might be something to discuss further.
Yeah, I think the argument or the discussion around institutions and institutional forms of rationality helps bring the points that Matthew mentioned earlier in terms of recognition, together with the explicit Marxist arguments of the book, in which the only way in which, as individuals, we conceive of ourselves as socially free is with a type of social fabric which allows mutual recognition, and that I think involved in this, we need to kind of look at the kind of the criteria for normatively acceptable form of society, and this is where the state argument comes in. And I wonder to what degree the semantic argument is perhaps an important one, because I suppose as soon as we start talking about states, we're talking about a level of violence and coercion involved in it, which I think Connell's totally right to say that there's some of the traditional forms of Marxism have looked at this question rather simplistically, or have just described the state as withering away and kind of wanted to finish there. And so bringing in some of the Hegelian positions, I think, helps strengthen what's happening within Marx's core claim, especially if we're going to take his phrase for, in the mature works, at least, for communism as a society of associated producers. The form of association there really does, I think, require some account of the institutions that would allow, that are actually social. So I think that's one aspect of it. I was going to mention a few things here about some of Martin's, in the replies to the book, William Clay Roberts one, but also this is the LRB, Los Angeles Review of Books. So a series of responses that Martin had to critics. There's a development of kind of some of the normative dimensions of the economic process that is conceived of in a democratically socialist society. And these are some of the questions that I finished my article with. So Martin talks about a rational price mechanism, and involved in this is a normative solution to problems of supply and demand. So it would allow producers, and this conception Martin might want to talk about it, but the idea is that it secures some form of the ability to both transparently, so rather than allocation or any type of allocation of resources happening behind producers' back, it allows people to understand what they're producing, how and why. So it deals with Marx's problems with an alienated form of life, but it also, through some type of technological device, allows us to think about what something might cost. And so not cost in a monetary sense, but cost in a normative sense. And so I think this is a concrete example of Martin's argument about what he calls the revaluation of value. So that moving from the tyranny of economic forms to the idea that values in our life should be something that are owned in a positive way.
So I wanted to just make a few remarks here on the connections between the book and eco-socialism and issues of ecology. I mean, one thing that I really like about the book is that it has this very strong kind of naturalist streak expressed in its account, as I was talking about before, of the human being as a particular kind of animal. And in some ways, this distinguishes the book from other works or figures in the kind of analytic Hegelian tradition that Martin is engaging with. Figures like Robert Pippin, Robert Brandom, John McDowell. That I think this life takes nature seriously in a way that that those thinkers don't. All that this life has to say about finitude, about value and exploitation is grounded in an account of us as a living organism. Right? It's all sort of built up from there, I think. So this kind of strong naturalist streak, I think, makes it kind of potentially useful from an ecological perspective, but of course, there's a really profound difference as well, is that in most contemporary ecology, not really eco-Marxism, but contemporary ecology outside of Marxism, there's this kind of suspicion of the idea of human distinctiveness. And we've discussed this a little bit already in relation to post-humanism. So I think that's a kind of interesting feature of the book from this perspective. I mean, even eco-Marxism, even in that sort of space, you still find, I think, a fair bit of hostility to Hegel and this sort of like old critique of Hegel as the kind of bad idealist, Marx as the good materialist. That's still there in eco-socialism as well. And so perhaps this book could help us address some of those issues. But more specifically, I think there are aspects of the account of time, the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, and so on, that could be useful from an ecological perspective, and for thinking through some of the degrowth arguments that are gaining some prominence in recent years on the socialist left. There is a sense in which we need to reduce and actually end at least certain forms of economic activity, and that there may be an ecological argument for reducing the amount of hours that we all work. But I think what we really need is not just an account of that as a kind of quantitative issue, but an account of the qualitative shifts in ownership, self-reproduction, and how we spend our time that would actually be required to bring that about, at least in a way where it wasn't simply imposed upon people. This is kind of the difference between eco-socialism and, say, like green austerity or something. That in a different kind of society, reducing working hours would also be an expansion of the realm of freedom. And I think articulating that is going to be politically really crucial for socialists in the coming decades. Yeah, and I wanted to link the text to the sort of Rift School of John Bellamy Foster, but maybe we can save that for the discussion or move on.
Great, thank you so much. I'll try to keep it brief so we also have time to have questions from the audience and interact with the people who are attending. But I wanted to pick up on all of these threads to emphasize, first of all, Matthew was saying towards the end, that like the relation to nature and the understanding of ourselves as living beings who depend on nature is very crucial to the book. And it's very important that that's not in conflict with the emphasis on these normative and institutional questions, because in a way the key is that like it is in our nature to be socially formed. That's the distinctive kind of natural beings we are, precisely because it's not given in our natural constitution who we should be and what we should do. But that's a question for us in a way that's not for other animals. That, you know, we have to learn through social habituation how to relate to one another, what to value, and so on. And that means that these normative collective questions are already at work, for better and for worse, in how we understand ourselves and one another and our relation to nature. And when I talk about the principles of democratic socialism, those principles are really like the principles that are necessary but not sufficient for a sustainable society. And I've tried to derive that from this imminent critique of capitalism. Like, these are the principles in light of which we would have to be organized to actually be able to own our freedom and own our responsibility to one another, to nature, to other living beings. That doesn't mean that they provide a blueprint for life, but they in the ways that I specified try to spell out that both how these are the principles for a sustainable form of life, and why it is because a capitalist form of life has to contradict those principles that it is unsustainable in all the various ways that the book spells out. One of the things that I've further elaborated after the book, and especially in these responses I've written for Lausanne Review of Books, is try to give further specificity to how we concretely could be organized locally and globally in light of those principles, and why that wouldn't entail a state in the way that Marxists understand it, as an apparatus for coercion and violence, but why the question that the state traditionally answered, namely, like, what are the shared social collective institutions that mediate our form of life, why that question won't go away. That's why I insisted on, like, we have to take on the question to which the state is an answer, and show how neither having a top-down coercive state nor just an immediacy of social relations, but like what would be the institutional forms that could form us in such a way that we can take responsibility for ourselves as social individuals who depend on one another locally and globally to reproduce our lives. And that's really like, that's in the book itself, but further elaborated, especially in part 3 of that LA Review of Books response, and among others in response to Connell's very pertinent questions about that in his review. But I'm mindful of the time, or the finite limited time that we have, so I don't want to. I want to make sure that we also have time for questions.
So I was thinking that for the next 5 minutes we could discuss amongst ourselves any final loose threads, and then at around 9:25 we can turn to the questions from our audience.
So Desmond, do you have something you want to follow up on to set us off, or?
Well, one thing I wanted to note before sort of tying together Matthew's earlier remark about the dispute over notions of recognition versus notions of redistribution, and the penultimate discussion of the treatment of laborers as means rather than as ends. I also think it's worth emphasizing that the very notion, I mean, one of the emancipatory features of capitalist modernity is the legal notion of recognition that's introduced. We are rights bearers, workers are entitled to sell their labor to whom they please. This is a monumental advance in human history. But in an amazing passage in the Grundrisse, which is has many Hegelian resonances, Marx actually presents this sort of vision of bourgeois mutual recognition and points out that actually the very notion of recognition of ourselves as ends in ourselves under capitalism, in recognizing ourselves as rights bearers and recognizing ourselves as the owners of our own labor power, that this entails the treatment of one another as means. So Marx actually shows that, both the capitalist and the laborer, under ideal circumstances, even when they abide by the labor contract, there's still exploitation, there's still extraction of surplus value. And so Marx's point is that precisely in treating themselves as ends, given the criteria for ends under capitalism, they just thereby treat one another as means under specifically capitalist conditions. So I take it that part of the point is that in the dispute over the liberal notion of recognition versus redistribution, is that the notion of recognition itself would have to be transformed. So this is sort of what Marx is showing in that passage, where he's really presenting, the bourgeois notion of equality and the bourgeois notion of recognition. There's a contradiction internal to both. So not only do we have to synthesize the economic and the cognitive questions, both sides of the equation have to be transformed under post-capitalist conditions.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a succinct way of stating, I think, what the ambition of my account in the second half of the book is. And just to be very clear on that point, I think it's helpful to say that, like, when we talk about recognition in this sense, it's not limited to institutional rights, explicit normative commitments, but that the question of recognition is built into, again, the way we relate to one another just to live and work, and that there is a sort of like misrecognition of one another built into that. That's in the very way in which we produce value, such that, like, to actually actualize and realize the idea of mutual recognition requires a transformation of our social and economic relations beyond redistribution, transforming the way in which we produce value. And that's why, the whole stalemate between redistribution and recognition has to be transformed, because it's redistribution is insufficient for achieving mutual recognition, and inversely, the liberal notion of recognition is insufficient for achieving actual recognition, precisely because recognition is, on the deepest level, a question of how we produce and reproduce our lives materially. And that's why we shouldn't choose between idealism and materialism, and Marx actually shows that in the deepest way.
Yeah, just to add something briefly to this discussion of recognition, I do think it's pretty interesting to see the kind of trajectory of the work of people like Robert Pippin and maybe Robert Brandom as well. These kind of Hegelian theorists, I wouldn't class them alongside with the liberal theorists of recognition we were discussing before, but, Hegelian theorists of recognition who, in many ways have been kind of shifting left in recent years. I mean, perhaps certainly true of Pippin. There's an article he published in The Point maybe a year or two ago, in which he has this really quite nice account of the theatrical life of the call center worker who's kind of selling something that he doesn't care about to people who don't want or need it. It's really coming through in that essay and some of Pippin's recent work that if you're committed to this Hegelian notion of sustaining practical identity through mutual recognition, it's sort of harder and harder to avoid a kind of engagement with Marx, or at least a critique of the ways in which capitalism puts pressure on that, or disables it, as I think you put it in the book, Martin. I look as a kind of rough diagnosis. I mean, you might just say, well, this is what happens if you're a kind of Hegelian theorist of recognition, and you kind of watch the disintegration of social life that we're kind of seeing in the past sort of decade or so. That here's where you have to kind of start heading, right? You can really see that pressure on practical identity and mutual recognition. I mean, it's just extremely clear now. So I think that's quite telling as well.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. So I think that's time for the discussion, and we'll move into the Q&A. So I'll read off the questions. So the first question is from Lucas Meisner, who writes, how would Martin relate his revolutionary atheist version of responsibly being on Earth as deciding on one's own lifetime with Benjamin's understanding of capitalism as a religion?
Great question. Well, the first thing to say is that the notion of capitalism as religion that Benjamin picks up from Marx, I mean, it's deeply related to my book in the sense that what that means is that capitalism is a form of religion for Marx, and I take it for Benjamin too, because it misrecognizes things that are actually products of our social activity as something that exists independently of us. You know, that would be the that's the most common denominator for religion, in the sense that like and this happens in capitalism in a way that like social relations and forms of domination that we are actually producing and reproducing through our mode of production and through how we relate to one another come to be seen as immutable laws of nature to which we are subject, you know, that has a sort of independent normative authority over us and commands us and subjects us. And then we understand that it's just like, well, that's just like the way things are, rather than like, no, this is a way in which we continually produce and reproduce ourselves and our relations to one another, and it could be done differently. And part of emancipation is recognizing, the first step towards emancipation is recognizing that what appears to be, you know, an independent reality that dominates us is actually a product of our own social activity. And that's the first step to recognizing that we could do things differently. And so that's one sort of connection to that strand of Benjamin. And another strand of, you know, is also there are conflicting aspects of this in Benjamin, but I think the most promising aspect of his notion of a secular notion of redemption that he has, where like, you know, where if we achieve an emancipated form of life, it's not like that would bring the dead back to life, but it would, in a sense, you know, redeem their struggles, not because it would make up for that they don't exist or for what they suffer, but because like we as historical beings, we can take up the products of the past and fulfill those promises. And that's part of, you know, a secular sense of redemption and fulfillment that doesn't deny finitude, but takes it into account and sees like, well, the highest good is actually the historical and social form of life that we can achieve together. And that would be like a secular understanding of things that often have been understood in religious terms.
Great. So our next question is from Tom Walker, who asks, disposable time is central to Marx's analysis of wealth versus value in the Grundrisse, but virtually disappears in Capital. To what extent can the Grundrisse be read as an imminent critique of Capital?
Great question. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to show are the ways in which the Grundrisse analysis and the Capital analysis are compatible if we think through the issues on the deepest level. But one thing to say about the category of disposable time in the Grundrisse, I take that to be like a suggestive but not yet fully worked out notion of time, because if we just cash out that like, oh, what we want is disposable time, it can look like this socially disembodied, just atomized disposable time for people to do whatever they want. Whereas like what I'm developing as socially available free time in the book is like time that can be like socially necessary labor, and like, but it's pursued as an end in itself rather than as a means for capital. And so there is a very powerful analysis in the Grundrisse that I dwell on, showing that like, yeah, the possibility of freedom has to do with surplus time, but you know, I don't think Marx in the final instance would embrace that as a category of just disposable time, but rather like free time is not free time free from labor or social demands, etc., but it's like being able to work and live socially in a way where you can like affirm the demands placed on you and the obligations you sustain and take up as expressions of your freedom. So freedom should be like, and free time is not freedom from normative demands, from working, from challenges, but the freedom to take those up as a social individual who always depends on others and who is always responsible and answerable for what they do. And it's about the ultimate horizon of transforming disposable time into free time is having a form of life where we can develop and sustain ourselves as socially responsible individuals in that sense.
I might just add something here as well. I think especially that section that Tom and Mun talking about the fragment on machines, the very small but illuminating part of the Grundrisse, attracted a huge amount of commentary in Marx studies, and rightly so. It's an important part of the text. I think we need to read that, and I agree with Mun here, as reading the Grundrisse, and this is, I suppose, following Bastone's argument as well, in light of Capital, and some of the most illuminating parts of the Grundrisse is discussion, Marx's discussion of social individuals, are fleshed out in a way that they aren't in Capital, but the concepts that become central in Capital in terms of commodity, money, and capital itself, as well as the concept of value, I think becomes much more difficult to reconstruct just on the terms of the Grundrisse. We need to kind of read it in light of Capital to make Marxist matures to some degree in terms of those specific arguments, especially in terms of his discussion of money and the relationship between the imminent measure of value in labour part and in abstract labour, and then the external measure in money. So there's a whole series of questions I think that we need to kind of read those six together rather than in opposition like someone like Negri would.
I would also just add a sort of a scholastic note that in the 61 to 63 manuscripts for Capital, Marx actually does further develop the notion of disposable time. So he's clearly still thinking about it, and it's still a thread as he's working on Capital proper. And going back to a suggestion that Postone made back in the 70s, that because of the tightly woven presentation of Capital proper, that the Grundrisse is actually key to sort of understanding some of the more positive and constructive moments of the text, like the account of disposable time that Marx provides. Because it is, such a focused imminent critique, it's so, sort of submerged in the phenomenon, there are less opportunities for Marx to sort of present any kind of positive vision. So the more fragmentary Grundrisse is, as Michael just said, can really be used to illuminate some of those other aspects of Capital that aren't, as at the surface. So our next question, let's see, is from Paul Reynolds. Paul asks, Nathan Brown in Radical Philosophy and his review of, and Nathan's excellent review of Martin's book, characterizes the book as a revival of Hegelian Marxism, but given the dialogue with Heidegger, it feels more relevantly phenomenological rather than idealist. I wonder if the discussion might lead into an existentialist, Sartrean direction with the optimism of Bloch balancing the pessimism of Sartre.
Great. This is a big topic. I'll say something brief about it. One of the things I'm trying to show in the book is that instead of choosing between idealism, materialism, phenomenology, like the right way in which we can develop the best insights in these traditions, to really give an account of all of these fundamental social, existential, normative questions. So it's very important for my methodology that I'm not aligning myself with camps like that, but drawing on various philosophical resources trying to be maximally rigorous with the specificity of those traditions, but seeing them all as contributing and illuminating aspects of what it means to be an essentially historical and social being that both essentially can be alienated and can be emancipated. And very importantly, as part of that trajectory, also not choosing between optimism and pessimism, because I think those notions are very contemplative notions, or at least they invite such a view as though, and instead of, whereas when we properly grasp that, like, we are the only ones who can enslave ourselves and we are the only ones who can liberate ourselves, the question of optimism and pessimism is very derivative and secondary in relation to the question of what kinds of social organization, what kind of self-understanding, practical and theoretical, must we develop to be able to achieve emancipation. And that's not a question of optimism or pessimism, that's a question of social organization and analysis.
Just a quick comment on this. Yeah, it's an interesting question. The relation between these schools of thought is very, it's worth pursuing and understanding. I mean, one thing I think the question shows, and maybe Martin's book shows, is just how close the early Heidegger, at least, actually is to Hegel, and maybe especially Kant in lots of ways, right? That he really is inheriting that tradition and using his own vocabulary, but it really is part of that tradition. Perhaps, later Heidegger's a different story.
I can briefly follow up just on the Sartre question. I mean, I think that there's one way in which Sartre's conception of freedom is very can be thought very powerfully in relation to a notion like species being, the negative capacity of us to put our own being in question. Of course, many of these thoughts are also have Sartre drawing from Heidegger, but Sartre is very insistent on that that constitutive negativity being something that that is fundamental to our freedom, but it very much does remain quite one-sided in Sartre, I think, and the kinds of social questions that Martin is bringing in, I think, are less available. And I think, again, just that's why it's not, the primary question isn't so much that Sartre is a pessimist. It's more that his conception of freedom is constitutively antisocial. It's a refusal. It's a kind of being free is negating the other. Merleau-Ponty, who's a much more Hegelian thinker, says, this idea that hell is other people, actually in that, if you take that seriously, if you draw out its implications that Sartre doesn't fully, well, actually hell is only other people because, I desire greater recognition from other people that I'm not getting. I desire better social relations that I'm not getting. And I think these are the kinds of thoughts that Sartre's philosophy is not so able to kind of grasp. And I think that's the side that I think, we don't want to lose that constitutive kind of negative capacity in order to think about freedom. But that has to be that is only ever expressed socially. And the kind of two sides of that are really what I think Martin is capturing.
I would also just briefly add that I think it's already implicit in the sort of Hegelian frame of the book that Hegel himself is largely trying to synthesize synthetic and trying to synthesize phenomenological and logical approaches. So in a way, Hegel already sort of anticipates that overcoming of those two philosophical models. But we'll turn to our next question here from Johnny Black. Johnny writes, if even our free time is unfree, what would it mean to fill in what is missing if the bourgeois subjectivity of the working class is missing? Does this relate to the potential for class struggle?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the nuance of the question. But I think I'll say this, that the important one, as we mentioned in the discussion, one important aspect of the analysis is that the emancipatory notion of free time that I developed should not be conflated with the sort of conception of free time that is a product of capitalist social relations, where like precisely because labor itself is experienced and is alienating, we conceive of like, free time and freedom as, freedom from having to work, freedom from having to relate to other beings, freedom from society, and that notion of freedom, that negative notion of freedom, I read as itself a symptom of an alienated form of society, unsatisfying form of social relations. So it's not like we have an originary drive to like, true freedom would be like, I'm free from others, I'm free from having to do anything. But rather that very notion of freedom is a product of the sort of society in which we live and work, and that, actual freedom would be to live and work in mutually satisfying social relations. So that's the way in which free time is not, actual free time in my sense under capitalism, and why under democratic socialism, the expansion of free time wouldn't have to be necessarily that we like work less or have more, but rather that like the time we devote both to labor and leisure, we can see the reasons for why it's a meaningful and responsible way of living our lives, and that would be the true form of freedom and free time. So that's why it's very important to not conflate the conception of free time under capitalism with what I call socially available free time under democratic socialism.
Great. So John Douglas McCready asks, how do you distinguish your account of imminent normativity from Rahel Yegi's account of the same?
Thank you for that question. So not to get too much into the critical theory weeds of various differences, I'll emphasize, first of all, that like the notion of imminent normativity is very important in the book, and it's on the deepest level, it's derived from that, like, with the advent of any living being, any forms of living organisms, as Matthew reminded us, there is the emergence of a sort of imminent form of normativity, because a living being, unlike a non-living being, is characterized by that it has a sense of that there's a sense of what it ought to do to sustain itself. And in light of that purpose of sustaining itself and its species, things can show up as good or bad, as threatening or appealing, as nourishing or damaging, And I want to say, like, if we're going to think about normativity, we have to ground it in that imminent normativity of any form of life, and then think of, our form of normativity as, a higher form of that rather than something separate from it. So where like that question of what we ought to do and how we ought to sustain our lives can fully come into its own. But an important part of retaining that ground in the natural material is to see that, like, that question, that imminent normativity and its whether it enables our flourishing or not, has to be kept all the way down and all the way up as a matter of how life is being reproduced materially. And there, I think Yegi's analysis doesn't have that grounding in Marxist analysis of labor the way I try to pursue it, and that's one way I've tried to spell out this notion of imminent normativity in a way to do justice both to Hegelian insights and to Marxian insights about the sort of constitutive question of labor understood as how life is being reproduced. And we can't eliminate that on any level for all of these, even for these seemingly ideal questions of recognition.
Okay, and our final question, which is from Aaron Marcus, is how do you see the relation between the concepts of imminent critique and genealogical critique, and the role of these concepts in the academic humanities, the political left? Deep questions, these are deep questions that divide the contemporary left regarding state, race, indigeneity, humanism, etc. and seem to hinge on whether such an imminent critique of liberalism is possible or even desirable. Do you think such a divide can be bridged?
Great question, and very important question. Not only do I think it can be bridged, I think it must be bridged. And I think such a bridge would transform and deepen both our understanding of genealogical critique and the sort of imminent critique. So just to clarify these terms for everyone involved, that like an imminent critique, such as I pursue, takes very seriously the professed ideals, says, of liberal and bourgeois modernity, and tries to show how they're contradicted by the capitalist form of life, and how they are necessary but not sufficient for developing an emancipatory horizon. Now, there, as Aaron Marcus there recalls, there's a kind of genealogical critique that is suspicious of that from the outset, because, and that would regard like, well, you know, there is nothing in these traditions that is worth salvaging, because those liberal ideals have supported all sorts of exploitation of nature, racism, imperialism, sexism, etc. And that is all true. And the truth content in genealogical critique is like reminding us of those historical and social contexts, and we should take that very seriously. But we shouldn't let that lead us to seeing how the very critique of those various ideologies and historical injustices, the standpoint that we have of being able to criticize that doesn't come from nowhere. And we can't understand how that standpoint is even possible without understanding the achievements of liberalism and modernity and so on. And so that's again, this is why like the proper kind of imminent critique incorporates genealogical insights, but also takes responsibility for the historical conditions of possibility for their own standpoint, and wants to give an account of, you know, how we must understand ourselves such that we can hold ourselves accountable that way, which is required for the genealogist, him or herself, if, you know, pointing out these hypocrisies, self-contradictions, historical forms of violence, you know, even doing that genealogical critique and that genealogical work presupposes that you assume that the people you're holding accountable in the present and the past, and the people you're speaking to, and the people you're condemning, that they are spiritually free in my sense, that is to say, that they can be held accountable and responsible for what they do, and we can demand that we should do things differently. And that self-understanding, even though that has always been implicit in the kinds of beings who we are, coming to recognize that, and coming to recognize us as essentially historically and socially responsible, and not being able to pass off our responsibility to either to nature or some higher authority, that is itself an achievement of modernity that is incomplete. And part of helping us complete it, we require genealogical insights, but we also require this form of imminent critique and appreciation of the historical achievements of the past that we also deem insufficient. So, and my book is really then trying to contribute to not buying into that either or, but also not simply saying like, oh, let's just combine the two, because on the contrary, developing a model that transforms the sense of both what's at stake in genealogical critique and what is at stake in imminent critique, and why that is the sine qua non of any emancipatory philosophy and any emancipatory politics.
Great. So we have a final few minutes here to pick up any loose threads and return to any of the questions that have been raised, if anyone has anything else they'd like to add.
I was going to maybe tie in a little bit, perhaps, this question that just came up about imminent critique versus genealogy, to also the question of class struggle that was raised earlier in a question. You know, I think one of the, you see this in some responses to the book, and kind of, you know, a question that can come up to sort of philosophical groundings of Marxism and of the value of socialism, of sort of like, okay, what is the use of this for, you know, activism, for class struggle on the ground today? You know, I think one of the dangers that a kind of purely like utilitarian kind of conception of like, we can only sort of, Marxist texts are useful in as much as they're useful to the immediate kind of political demands of the present, is that it can precisely fall into a kind of purely like, we're just talking about who has power over whom. And just to recall the kind of Nietzschean kind of framework that this kind of notion of genealogy is obviously also tied to, which I think kind of comes back to the points that Matthew was making earlier about Foucault, and also just what Martin just said. There's always an implicit normativity to any kind of any statement, any claim, any absolute claim. A genealogical perspective has to be speaking from somewhere. It's not fully able to realize that, to acknowledge that. Nietzsche isn't able to acknowledge the position from which he can claim that all assertions of truth are fundamentally assertions of power. All claims about the world are fundamentally assertions of power. What is the perspective from which he is able to do that, as opposed to just himself asserting his own power by claiming it? So I think that's the limitation of these kind of purely treating the, this is a kind of failing of the book, that it's not kind of directly like, it has to be judged entirely on its political utility. There is obviously a question, this we probably don't have time to go into very much, but the question of how we think about proletarian, specifically proletarian self-consciousness, as a kind of transitional question of the proletariat as the kind of collective, the group that are going to see their own interest in carrying out the overcoming of capitalism. So that's a kind of larger question that we may not have time to discuss much now, but in what ways does Martin's framing of democratic socialism and the imminent critique of capitalism re-articulate that kind of question, the question of transition, of who the kind of collective group will be, how they will articulate themselves in terms of seeing this transition as their own distinct activity. So I think there's ways in which those two questions can kind of be thought together.
Yeah, I just want to add to that in response to Johnny's question, which I've been thinking about for the last few minutes. And what I take Johnny to be pointing to is the fact that there really is no, as there was in the early 20th century, something like a unified proletarian movement for socialism. And I take it that what Johnny is after is, what it would mean under conditions of unfree time, what it would mean for there to be some kind of unified collective subjectivity. And maybe one way of getting at what Johnny is after is that, as Lukács points out in History and Class Consciousness, the phenomenon of reification is not overcome in one blow. It's something that's overcome over time. There's always sort of regressions, and it's part of the actual movement of determining, what must be done through some kind of party apparatus or through concrete political struggle. And I take it that also for the question of free time, that that requires a kind of collective activity of synthesis. And what a proletarian movement for socialism would actually contribute is it would allow for a kind of collective synthesis of our time, of projecting, consciously projecting a new collective purpose into the future, appropriating our history or overcoming the past. So actually, I take it that that sort of collective activity is really necessary for synthesizing something like a collective form of free time.
Yeah. Great, because you guys helped me now hear Johnny's question in a clearer way. I don't think so because this is a helpful, and it's probably a good place to end, actually, that another aspect of this question that we don't only have surplus time like other animals. We can ask ourselves what we ought to do with it, and that can be emancipatory or alienating. And a very concrete way in which that is in freeing up time, that's also freeing up time for workers to organize and develop a form of self-consciousness that is itself a step towards emancipation, and that's a way of even within capitalist social relations starting transforming sort of empty free time into socially committed and responsible and meaningful free time. So, and that's obviously, like, on the one hand requires sort of concrete forms of social organization that, as Jensen called, are not historically in place now. But I also think an important aspect, and I say this in the conclusion, is that the sort of work that my book is doing, even though it's not sufficient in any way, it's a necessary aspect of social revolution, and it's itself not just a theoretical activity, it's itself a form of practice, because, you know, changing our understanding of who we are and who we could be and where we find ourselves and where we should be committed to going, that is itself a sort of intervention that seeks to counter forms of reified self-consciousness. And again, very far from sufficient, but a necessary aspect of the socialist project that the book seeks to be true to.